I'm going to demonstrate the bias bound treatment for you. What is it? Let's look at it. Can you see this is the wrong side of my garment or the swatch, where the seam allowance gets a special and beautiful treatment. And if you look carefully, you will find out that on the edge of the seam allowance, we have stitched another piece of fabric and then folded under, tucked under, and then stitched right on top of it. Why do we do this? As you can see, this seam allowance inside of the garment would look really pretty. Sometimes, let's say if we make a jacket and the jacket doesn't have a lining, we want the seam allowances to look pretty, not just overlocked or finished some other way. Obviously, we have so many different ways of finishing the seam allowances, but this is one sophisticated treatment that we apply on the seam allowances of garments. Now I'm going to show you how to do this. In order for me to prepare myself to do that treatment, I need to prepare 2 swatches, and I'm going to place these 2 swatches face to face, and I am planning to stitch 3/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I am pinning on the 3/4 of an inch line, and I'm going to be stitching this in a second, 3/4 of an inch seam allowance here. But before that, I need to prepare also 2 strips of fabrics for my bias binding. As the name says, those 2 fabrics or fabric pieces should be cut on bias. So here's my piece of fabric that I'm going to cut my bias strips from. This is like a little printed fabric here. Now, this is the salvage of this fabric. That means this was the straight grain of it. I'm not going to cut my strips from the straight grain because the straight grain fabric is not stretchy, doesn't stretch. Can you see sometimes we even can apply the bias binding on curvy necklines or on curvy hemlines or armhole. You see the bias fabric actually is very flexible and it moves, it twists, but the fabric cut from the straight grain would not do it. Neither would do on a cross grain cut strip. So how do I cut my bias binding? Can you see if this is my straight grain, this is my cross grain, then my 45-degree bias is right here, okay? So if I would draft a line, let's say this is 45-degree because this side of the fabric is even to this side, I'm eyeing it, but if I draft a line, so that will be my bias line going like that. So on this line, I am going to measure 1 inch. If you place your ruler's 1 inch mark on that line, then you will be drafting another perfectly parallel line, which is showing your cut lines for your bias strips. Okay, so I have 2 strips drafted on my fabric, and I'm going to cut them and get them ready for my project. As you can see, these strips are bouncing. Please don't touch them, don't stretch them, because when you stretch them, they are going to become narrower, okay? So that's why be gentle with them. So now let's stitch our 3/4 inch seam allowance and come back for the bias bindings to be applied. First press the fabric for the seam to relax, and then open the seam allowance and press it one more time. Now let's get the bias binding on them. I am binding my seam allowances. So I take my strip and I put right on top of this side. You can start with whichever side you want to. Let's say my choice is to start with this side of the seam allowance. Here I take my bias binding and place the edges matching like this, and I am going to pin them to each other. My intention is to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance here, kind of like a small 1/4 inch, not very big. So gently, without pulling, without stretching the fabric, you are going to pin these two edges to each other like this. So I'm working on this side only. Now I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance here. Now, in order for me to stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance precise, I'm going to keep the edge of the fabric matching to the edge of the presser foot. In that position, my needle is going to be hitting on the 1/4 inch point of the fabric. So it's a little bit larger than 1/4 inch on my machine, but definitely I can place it in a way that it will be hitting not to the very edge, but the middle of the foot. Again, always double check that the fabric is not getting trapped under and you're not stitching something that you're not supposed to. So I'm going to again relax my seam, and look, if I push this open, you can see that it is attached to my seam allowance, and I'm getting ready to bind the edge of my seam allowance. So here's what I do. I'm going to fold the edge of my bias binding under and making sure that my fabric is completely under there, and also I would like to make sure that my fold is even. So I'm controlling my seam allowance like this. You see, I'm tucking the fabric edge underneath, always trying to keep my seam allowance 1/4 inch even, like this. So from that will depend the success of your bias binding. Can you see I'm not really happy what happened at the end? If I didn't like it, I will open it up and I will try again, making sure that the outcome is to my liking here. So I came up with this. Now the edge of the fabric is under, so it binds the unfinished or fraying edge of the fabric, and the remaining fabric is underneath. Now I would like to suspend that fabric there, okay, so it doesn't come out. What I need to do is I need to stitch from the top to finish up this side, so then I go ahead and do the other side. And then I have two ways of doing it. One way of stitching is going to be, when I stitch right at the edge of the bias binding, just the same way as you stitch the edge stitch, like this, or you can stitch right on top of the seam, which is called stitch in the ditch. Okay, so both of them are good. You can either stitch on the edge or right on the stitch. One will be like edge stitch, the other one will be stitch in the ditch. So I edge stitched my bias binding, and as you can see, by doing so I also caught the fabric edge underneath, so when it's sitting inside of the garment it's gonna look like this. Now I am ready to do the other side. For the other side, please follow the same exact steps. Again, here you need to finish both sides of the seam allowance just like this one. If you look closely, you can see that on this one I have stitched stitch in the ditch, which means the stitch is right at the fold. Meanwhile, the one that I stitched today is stitched right on top of the fold. Both of them are okay, whichever way you want to do, whichever way fits your needs, that's what you do. And again, the seam allowances are not stitched on the background, but they're staying loose like that. So this will conclude my demonstration for the bias bound seam allowances for you. See you next time.